I came across an interesting, I guess a bogus news item, actually, I think it is. Must have come off the internet. But in a survey, 60% of respondents said the cities they live in are noisier than they were 10 years ago. 60%. The other 40% didn't hear the question. So, anyway, yeah, there we go. We're going to use that line a lot here today, I think. But I'm sorry for the people in back. We're going to have to talk loud. And Josiah's kind of well, he's used to speaking in front of crowds, so he'll blurt it out. But if you can't hear, just let us know, and we'll try to talk louder around here. I've been looking forward to this presentation, both for the topic and for the presenter. Josiah Pollock is a young historian and museum professional. He studied Pacific Northwest history his entire life. He's a graduate of the UW Tacoma and has specialized in local and agricultural history related to the Hudson's Bay Company and Puget Sound Agricultural Companies. His paper on the Cowlitz Farm is said to be the first piece of 21st century scholarship on a pivotal piece of early Washington state history. Pretty neat for a young guy. And, well, he's an old family, actually. Well, he'll get into that, I'm sure. But anyway, Josiah works for the Fort Nisqually Living History Museum in Point Defiance. And that's where I first met him, as he was in costume educating the public about the Hudson's Bay Company. And I was impressed and encouraged. And as I always am, especially when a younger person gets involved in a passion for history. There's not that many young people that get that passion, and we just love it. In the future, he plans on pursuing graduate education at Iowa State University and a PhD in agricultural history that he's going to be aiming for, so we're encouraged about that. We don't want to lose him to the Northwest, so I hope you come back once you go there. We're going to learn about aspects of the Hudson Bay Company that most of us are not familiar with. We think of fur trapping and trading, but the many farm operations that have played such a huge role for the company is something that is very, very interesting. And so let's get to it. We're starting a little bit early, so we'll end a little bit early for question and answer afterwards. But let's give a big Schmidt House welcome to Josiah Pollock.
Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. Can you hear me back there in the back? Okay. One person says no. I will try and talk as loud as I can. I have been told before that people can't really hear me. So thank you, Don, and thank you, Schmidt House, for letting me come and tell you about the Cowlitz Farm. How many of you have heard of the farm before? Okay, a good handful of people. When I first started this project, I didn't really know about it. I have been involved with Fort Nisqually most of my life. Had the farm mentioned to me multiple times when I started on the employees almost about 5 years ago. I really wanted to figure out what the farm was, and so when I was given the opportunity to write my capstone paper for my graduate degree, or for my undergraduate degree, I was like, well, let's do the Cowlitz Farm. So this painting was done in 1841, 1845. This is the Cowlitz Farm. Viewing and erupting Mount St. Helens. And so if you look up top, there is smoke plumes to the left of St. Helens, and in the decade of the 1840s, St. Helens was in continuous eruption, and this can be seen through Hudson Bay journals, native lore, all sorts of area. So this painting was done by Ware, who was one of the 2 British spies who came out here in the 1840s under the direction of Queen Victoria to evaluate and understand if this region could be defended in case there was war between Great Britain and the United States over the Puget Sound area. That didn't come. They said, you don't want to lose the Puget Sound region, but you can't actually defend it. And so this became, so what you see here is kind of the farm area. Now, it is down in a little area. This is the 1855 map of Washington, and it's down here in a little area called the Cowlitz Corridor. The Cowlitz River comes down off Mount Rainier. It flows west and then at a place called Cowlitz Landing, it heads south and flows, actually due south, right into the Columbia River, and enters at Monticello, which is an important aspect of it. And this had been the major thoroughfare to get into Western Washington for millennia. This is the way that the tribes would go. The tribes along the Columbia who controlled most of the trade, yes.
Where's Olympia on that map?
Olympia is going to be right south, so you can see Puget Sound right here. This is the Sound. Olympia is right there. So we're about 60 or so miles to the north of where the farm actually is. And it was a major thoroughfare. You would get into a canoe, and you would go up the Cowlitz River from the Columbia, and then at Cowlitz Landing there was a very large Cowlitz village, the Cowlitz tribe. One of the biggest village was at Cowlitz Landing, and where that village existed, you couldn't maneuver the river any further up. So that was as far as you can go up the river, and that was about 50 lodges there for the Cowlitz tribe, and that was Chief Scanawa. I had actually Scanawa, okay. Not quite sure how his name's pronounced. And they controlled trade for the entire region. So in order for trade goods to come up the Columbia Gorge into the Puget Sound area, you have to come to the Cowlitz tribe. So it's a very politically powerful tribe. They had a lot of horses, a lot of property, and Chief Scanawa, he was even warring with tribes on Vancouver's Island. And so he had a lot of range, a lot of area to control. And that's what the Hudson Bay Company arrived to when they arrived in the Columbia Department region in the early 1800s. The first, now, in 1821, there were two warring companies, the Puget Sound, or the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, were at odds with each other. The Hudson's Bay Company had control of most of Canada that we know today. Their posts were along Hudson's Bay. Everything stretched out west from there. And the Northwest Company had posts in Montreal and pushed through what is today the United States. But in there was a little skirmish that took place at a place called 12 Oaks in between Hudson's Bay Company and the Puget Sound, or in the Northwest Company. We'll get to the Puget Sound Agricultural Company, I promise, which made the Parliament in Great Britain intervene between the two companies. There was war between them over fur rights, over a lot of stuff, but at 12 Oaks, the Northwest Company attacked the Hudson's Bay Company and killed a governor, like Lord Selkirk was killed, and a couple other people, and so it was now a huge issue. They couldn't have their own colonial imperial businesses warring over each other in the colonies. So Parliament steps in and says, no, we have to merge these two companies, and they become one underneath Hudson's Bay. Everybody associated with the Northwest Company was down in the Columbia Department, which is along the Columbia River. John McLaughlin was an ex-NWC who joins the company very reluctantly and has wars with Governor Simpson for his entire time serving the company. And he is dragging his feet when Simpson says, you have to start farming. Before the merger, the Columbia Department, which is Washington, Oregon, parts of Northern California, Idaho, British Columbia, parts of Alberta, and even Wyoming, so a gigantic administrative district. The Hudson Bay Company, I think, had close to 9 administrative districts that had carved up North America so that they could easily manage what was going on out here. They were buying all their foodstuffs from London at an extreme cost. And so in 1825, Simpson tours to North America, and he says, to McLaughlin and crew. He said, no, you cannot buy your foodstuffs anymore. You're the most costly district to run. You have all these natural resources. You have so much farming potential, so you're going to start farming. And so that's what McLaughlin starts Fort Vancouver. Fort Vancouver, the original distribution facility was at Fort George, which was Fort Astoria. They have to move Fort Vancouver about 100 miles up the Columbia River so that they can start farming a 100-acre plain that's been well watered. And by the 1840s, pretty much all of the Columbia River is a massive, massive farm that's taking care of these operations. So they start farming at Fort Vancouver, and fast forward a couple years, McLaughlin goes back to London and approaches the governor of the Hudson Bay Committee and says, we need to start an agricultural company to sell our product. And I petition that we start an organ hides and tallow company, and we'll send cow hides and beef tallow back to London to feed your hungry mills. And the governor says, well, no, we're going to start the Puget Sound Agricultural Company because we just ratified the Moscow Agreement with the Russians, and we have to provide with all their food now. And so in, I believe it was 1825, the Russian-American Company and the Hudson Bay Company had been in a quasi-war with one another. And it got to the point up in Alaska at a place called Sitkine, or Stickine, I don't quite remember what the fort was, on a little river there. Dr. Tolmie, who had just recently arrived, it was the 1830s, he was up there, and a Russian gunboat comes up the river, and the Russian colonial, I think it was some sort of high officer, colonial officer, says, if you don't vacate the fort, we'll fire on you. And so Tolmie, and I think it was Archibald MacDonald who was with him, said, okay, see you later. And they packed everything up and left. And Great Britain was already in very tense political relations with the Russians regarding everything. And it would come to a head in Crimea in 1854, just 20 years later. But they weren't going to let those political relations be strained again in the colonies by their company with the Russian-American Company. So they signed the agreement, which said that Hudson Bay Company will have trapping rights into Alaska, but because we cannot actually supply our own Russian-American Company with their food supplies, the Hudson Bay Company can. The Russians required about 14,000 bushels of grain for a yearly sum, and in 1850, the imperial bushel was about 60 pounds. So that's a lot of grain, and that wasn't enough grain to be grown by just McLaughlin at Fort Vancouver. And so there were other settlements, Champoeg down on the Willamette River down in Oregon. That was a retired community of a lot of Hudson Bay and Northwest Company people who lived down there. They were farming, but they were only able to meet about half the Russian demand. And so in 1838, McLaughlin sends his second and like 100 cows up to this place called the Cowlitz Farm. Now they knew where to be because, fast rewind a little bit, in 1818, French-Canadian Northwest Company official named Simon Plamondon ascended that river in a little canoe, and he met the daughter of Chief Skaneawa, and they were married. And he became part of the tribe and settled in that area, and a couple other French Canadians settled with him, and it was a lot of the people who came through, Wilkes and others, called it a romantic settlement, the most civilized they had seen in their tour of the Northwest. They had fenced in the area. It was beautiful prairie land. They were farming for themselves and for the Hudson Bay Company as well. And so that's where this farm was going to be. So the Hudson Bay Company goes up there. they talked to Plum and Dunn. He says, there's an area here where you guys can start to farm. And so by 1840, they had planted grain, and they had the cows up there, and they were going to start moving some sheep up there as well, and just started it. It didn't start out well. The farm didn't actually start out well. They're still in a transition period between becoming fur trading and farming. There was McLaughlin dragged his feet all the way to make that transition from fur to farm. There was a lot of officials in the company who were not cool that their fur people were going to farm, and the company officials tried sending European families out, English families who knew farming and knew how to run it. And these people, in 1839, when McLaughlin returned with the directions to establish the Puget Sound Agricultural Company, he brought 5 families with him, and they left in 1841. They went back to England. So there was not a lot of desire to be out in this wilderness at that time. And farming hadn't really caught up with the modern world as of yet. 1844, we have the Irish potato famine, and that really let the world know that how we farm is probably not the best way, because it was a lot of monoagriculture. You grew one crop for a long time. That was the issue in Ireland. They grew one type of potatoes. They had grown that one type of potatoes for forever. The crop failed. What people don't know is that in 1845, the year after, the wheat crops failed in England. So they actually couldn't support the Irish farmers and the Irish people with their own food supplies because their own wheat crops failed. So that was very eye-opening to the Hudson Bay Company. They knew that if they're going to have this Puget Sound Agricultural Company, that it needed to be the most modern, the most advanced agricultural site out there, and they could study extensive crop rotation and a lot of new and modern agriculture that was taking place in the middle 19th century. This is another image from where this is a bateau. Now, to get anywhere, the Hudson Bay Company built these boats. They called them Columbia boats or bateau. They're a little bit different than a York boat. York boats are what the Hudson Bay Company is using in along Hudson's Bay area. These boats were all built at Colville, which is underwater now. It's Kettle Falls areas is where Colville was. They were built of a yellow pine, and they were clinker built, which means that all the pieces were overlapped. George Roberts, who was in charge of Cowlitz Farm later on, describes the construction of these boats. They're about 6 feet wide and 30 feet long, so gigantic boats, and could carry up to about 3 tons of weight. And this was how the company would move their cargo around the area. And these are the boats that are going up and down the Cowlitz River that were hauling all the goods. This is the farm. The map dates actually cut off, probably early 1840s. And you can see, and you'll see it better on the next map, but it has a bunch of different numbered fields. And that was something that they had put into practice, where they had taken these fields, they'd given them a number, and each field had so many acreage, and they would practice crop rotation. Now, you can see it better on this one. I'm going to get my little poker out, where they would do things. So you have coal seed in 1846, wheat in 1847, again on those 2 fields. You have timothy here, you've got turnips there, you've got timothy here, clover, timothy. What would happen is you grow wheat crop. It pulls nutrients out of the soil, and you have to add those nutrients back, and this is what they were understanding and finding out at the time period. So if you've grown wheat for successive years, then you need to give the soil a rest. And so what they would do is they would follow wheat with clover, which is adding nutrients back into the soil. And Edward Huggins, who was clerk at Fort Nisqually, went and was actually in charge of the Cowlitz Farm for a couple of months in 1855. He said that whenever he went there, there was always thick crops of red clover that had been there for a very long time, and it was very rich soil there. And so the farm could actually grow a decent amount of grain if it was managed correctly, just because it was river valley, it was very rich soil, and they were able to like regrow lots. Clover would actually be grazed down. They would park their sheep and cattle on it. And this was something the Hudson Bay Company did a lot, was you have your crop, and they would even graze over green grain. So winter wheat was the most commonly planted types of grain out here. They tried spring wheat. It just didn't grow so well because it's a shorter growing season. But if you plant winter wheat, it can access sun that we might get in January, but that didn't happen this year. And the nice weather we usually get in February. But at that time, it's still too wet to plant grain or it'll rot in the ground. But if you plant in October, November, December, and you plant a winter wheat, then you have a better chance of getting a decent crop. And so that's what the company did. They planted winter wheat mostly. When the spring wheat pops up, well, to delay when the wheat would actually be ripe, they would graze it off. So what happens is your animals need green grass. They've been on dry hay for all year, for most of the winter. So green grass comes up, you park your sheep and your cattle on it, they graze it down. They're not going to destroy the wheat itself, but what happens is they get benefit nutrients and they're dropping benefit nutrients on top of the wheat, so you get a better crop than you would have if you didn't graze it down. What happens is, grazes down, it delays harvesting time by about a month. And so winter wheat that would have been ripe in June is now ready in late July or even early August, when we know that it's going to be good weather for harvest time. And so that really helped improve the crops that were being grown in and around the Cowlitz Farm. And then they're following with turnips. And turnips will help break up the soil. They send long taproots down in so that it can aerate the soil, but the turnips are animal feed. And there's Fort Langley just made a post about a turnip chopper they have in their collection, which I have used a later model of a turnip chopper, a Mangel Wurzel slicer, which is a really nasty machine. You almost get your fingers chopped up because there is no protection from the blades, where you just stick Mangel Wurzels down inside. Mangel Wurzel is a tuber related to a beet, also used in animal food. You have to chop it up real fine so they actually can digest it. And these are the types of crude machinery that would have been employed by the company to help feed their cattle and pigs and sheep and other things. By the 1850s, mid-1840s, the Cowlitz was about 4,000 acres under cultivation, a gigantic piece of land. All prairie land, of course, prior to a lot of American settlement of the area. This area from Canada all the way to California was interspersed with tiny prairies, pretty big prairies, and very few stands of timber. There would be a small belt of timber that would separate prairies from each other, and they were scattered over with the Gary oak, which is our native oak tree, which you still can see down here in places like Lakewood and even further south. You'll still see a lot of those Gary oak. And so that's kind of this area that was being farmed. It was easy. The sod was this blue bunch grass, which you could turn into hay quite easily, and then you can just plow that in. And there was about 8 different types of plows that they were using down at the Cowlitz. One was a Norfolk plow, which was a gigantic plow that could cut a furrow that is about 8 inches deeper than a regular type plow, because it was for potatoes. And so you want your potatoes deep down in the ground so that you can grow more potatoes. And so they had these just different types of machinery. For the 1840s, it was really advanced with the machinery access they had. Even in 1839, before McLaughlin has established the farm, he's already purchasing wheels for a threshing machine. And at this time, threshing machines were brand new. They were in their infant stages in really kind of crude machines. The threshing machine at Cowlitz was multiple times, to quote them, shaken all to pieces. And they would have to fix it. And it's probably about, it's a little smaller than this room, but a huge, huge machine. And grain would go in one side on the stalks, come out the other side, and then somehow the chaff would be removed. And it was probably belted by a team of horses. And so they have a huge belt sitting on it, and they'd have a team of horses sitting on there and just walking on this belt, which would power the machine. You'll see that in a lot of early 20th century agriculture, turn of the century area. You'll see some of that. And this was early on in the stages of the farm's development. These are some of the types of animals and things that would have been grown around the fort. The cattle is a Creole cattle, or a Criollo, which is a Spanish cow. It just means like mixed, I think was a term, like a Creole. And it was this wild cow that got loose from some of the early Spanish settlers and grazed over North America. McLaughlin bought 100 cows, I believe. They drove them up from California. And that was the first cattle drive in this area, probably in North America at that time, because there wasn't a lot of Texas ranches established in the 1830s. And they drove about 200 cattle up from California to Fort Vancouver. And those are the first stock. And when the American settlers started arriving, he said, "You can have anything you want, but I'm not giving you cows." And from that few cows that he brought up there, they dispersed them around. English breeds were brought over from England to help breed a lot of the wildness out of the cow. Didn't quite work. But it's a small cow. It's a dual purpose, which means it can milk and meat. They didn't milk that well. And even when they did bring English families over to help with the milking, the English families couldn't really get the cows to milk either. And that's when you have a dual purpose breed, usually it does both things okay. It doesn't do one thing really good. So that's the type of cows it was. And they grazed all over. The sheep would have been, that is a Southdown right there, and the other one next to it's a Leicester, the long-haired one. Those are the type of English breeds that were brought over. Again, Spanish Merino sheep were driven up from California and then bred into that. But the Cowlitz focus mostly on the middle picture there, which is that's a white lammas, what they call the Hudson Bay wheat. That is being reproduced at a couple farms. Palouse Heritage is reproducing that right now. And then we also have our own crop of white lammas wheat that we're growing up at Fort Nisqually, and we're trying to increase our seed bank so that we can grow a decent amount of that stuff. It's called Hudson Bay wheat. WSU had some in their collections, and it had a note on it that it said Hudson Bay wheat. And so that's the type that was being grown. They would also grow a Sonora wheat, which was purchased from Spanish California again. And then the pig is a Berkshire, and there was about 50 sties at Cowlitz, which is a lot. There was about 300 to 500 hogs, and they were salting. Most of the meat at the time period was being salted. So they'd butcher a pig, they'd put it in a barrel, they'd fill it with salt, and then they would send it down by bateau to the mouth of the Cowlitz River, where it would be taken over to Fort Vancouver and then shipped out from there. One thing they were also doing was salmon fishing. Now, there's two areas of the company that was exporting salted salmon over to the Hawaiian Islands, what they called the Sandwich Islands at the time, the Cowlitz Farm and Fort Langley. Now, the Cowlitz tribe had a fishing weir, multiple of them, right across the Cowlitz River, right at Cowlitz Landing, and which was a good 3 miles from the farm itself. The Hudson Bay Company employed Native Americans to work on their sites. That was an easy way to get a lot of manpower when we needed it, and the tribes were then paid in goods or foodstuffs or whatever they were looking for. And when fishing season came around, all the native labor from the Cowlitz farm left because all the tribes went to fish because that's how they lived. And so the company encouraged the gentleman in charge of the Cowlitz Farm to see if the natives wouldn't give them fish to help improve their salt salmon trade with Hawaiians. And the tribe says no. So the company decided they were just going to build their own weir and fish their own weir and catch salmon that way. And it became a major aspect of a lot of the agriculture going on at the farm. A weir is a bunch of sticks that are stuck inside of a stream, usually with a couple openings where there's fish traps stuck behind them. And what happens is the salmon will swim up, and they'll kind of just like swim around to figure out where exactly they can get through this dam in the river. And oftentimes there would be platforms set up on top of them, and the tribes could just spear the fish as they're trying to figure out where to go, and that's how they would fish. And so that's what the company was doing, and we employed actually some of the tribe to fish for the company. And then they would salt them in barrels. So you'd have, and they were actually manufacturing these barrels down at the farm. They called them a salmon barrel, and it actually becomes a term of measurement at the farm. And what the size is, it's really unknown. A lot of the coopering that was done at Fort Nisqually or at the Cowlitz Farm, and even at Fort Vancouver, was not really standard with what we know of today because it was a lot of country made. And so a salmon barrel was a distinct type of cask created at the Cowlitz Farm, usually recycled from other types. But they would put a layer of salt in the bottom, fish, salt, fish, salt, fish, salt, till it's full, and then they would seal it up, and then they would send it to the Hawaiians. And lumber and salt salmon went to the Hawaiians. Coffee and workers came out here. And so a lot of the Sandwich Islanders, what they called Kanakas at the time, worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. There was a Kanakan village, very large Kanakan village down at Fort Vancouver. And then there was also a few Kanakas employed at Cowlitz, but the majority of them, is about 11 Kanakas employed in 1855 alone at Fort Nisqually, and they were mostly shepherds. They worked very well with the sheep, took great care of the flocks and herds of sheep that were all around. That is the type of fencing that you see up in the corner that was in the area. It's called stake and rider. Sometimes it's called worm fencing. You'll see that mostly in American terminology. But the stake and rider was everywhere, and that's what Wilkes saw when he called the area the most civilized area he'd seen since he arrived. And the fields were cross-fenced. We can go back to this photo there. Each of those fields would have been numbered, but not necessarily always fenced. The most areas that they would have kept fenced was going to be around the buildings. Unlike today, where we fence our animals in, they fenced them out. And there was one record where a cow had gotten into an oat shed and had eaten himself full. He had broken through the fences and got into the oat shed and just ate and ate and ate. And this was before a lot of the agriculture had changed and it was more scientific, but the employees just ran the cow around till he died. And so when George Roberts inherited the farm, and he's the one that we have the most information from regarding the farming operations, he was very distraught with how the animals had been treated, the fencing situation, and a lot of the other aspects. And he's quoted in saying that if it was up to me, I would stop all the farm labor and fix the fences right now because, one, the Spanish mission, which is east of the farm, had cows too, and they kept breaking in and eating the wheat when it wasn't supposed to be eaten. The French Canadians, Simon Plamondon and a lot of the other gentlemen, had petitioned McLaughlin to get them a Spanish priest into the area, or a Catholic priest. And McLaughlin petitioned the Diocese of Quebec, I believe, and they sent Modeste Demers and Francis Blanchette out to establish the St. Francis Xavier mission on Cowlitz Prairie. And so it worked twofold. It helped with the French Canadian laborers who wanted the mission, and also with the Cowlitz tribe, because a lot of the tribes in the area requested black robes from the company for their spiritual needs. And so the mission arrived. Sections of land were given to it by the farmers, the French Canadian farmers, and then their border is right here. That's kind of the border between the fort and the farm. It's hard to see on this map just exactly topographically where the farm existed in the Cowlitz Valley itself, but this is the house right here, and this is a large 2-story granary which was built to house the 8,000 bushels of grain that could be grown on the Cowlitz site, which when the Russians need 14,000 and your farm can grow 8, that's a big help in trying to meet that demand. The house was actually gigantic. It was about 7 rooms, and people always refer to it as a not built in the Hudson Bay style, which was post on sill. You'll see that kind of architecture at Fort Nisqually and some of the other buildings around. But it was a framed house, quite large, and had a commanding view of both Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens. And Edward Huggins mentioned that the farm situation was so pretty that he didn't even think it was real, just because of the commanding view that you had of both those mountains just from the front porch of the house. And then these area here would be outbuildings, the kitchen's back there, the granary, these are the pigsties down here, and then some of these names on these buildings are some of the employees who would have a shed here where they were monitoring a band of sheep somewhere. And then the little numbers are the different types of barns that would have been on the field. From here, the grain would have been loaded into bateau and shipped down to Monticello or Monticello, which is the mouth of the Cowlitz River. And that's where Hudson Bay ships, ocean-going brigs, would pick up the grain and take it up to Sitka, which is where they would deliver it up to the Russians. Is that a hand? Yeah.
How many people would work this?
That's an excellent question. It's unknown. During harvest time, they employed about 40 cradlers, and that's just to cut the grain down with. There was always fluctuating. There was probably about close to 200 tribesmen and tribeswomen who worked on the farm. But as of labor themselves, I don't fully know. Yeah.
Hi, sorry. I didn't know if we were, interjecting or...
Totally. I am used to being interrupted when I'm talking to people as a historical interpreter at Fort Nisqually, and so that's kind of how I explain the story a little bit more, just in case you're not getting something, so please feel free to, yeah.
I am an enrolled Cowlitz elder.
Okay.
My great-great-grandfather was Kanaka from the island of Maui, who worked the Cowlitz Farm. I came today because I'm always doing research for my book on my family history. I was going to correct you on 2 things at the end, but just real quickly. My grandfather came to Cowlitz Farm directly via Fort Vancouver in 1836. He was there till 1850. Then was transferred to Nisqually. When the Indian Wars broke out, he was put into concentration camps. So Kanakas were coming during the 1820s, as you did say. However, servants at Cowlitz Farm was about 70% Kanaka. It was only 10% Native, and only the manager and the farm manager and I forgot what their not chief, the next one up from manager, were French Canadian. So when you had mentioned going back, and I'm sorry, just tell me to shut up if you want me to. When you were talking about crop rotation, I was hoping to hear you say that the influence for crop rotation at both Fort Vancouver, which was transferred to Cowlitz Farm, and Nisqually Farm were the influences of the Native American, the Cowlitz people, and the Kanaka. Kanaka were already doing crop rotation on the islands. So the crop rotation was more of an indigenous influence as opposed to Hudson's Bay out of London. The other thing I wanted to mention is that when the George Robertson family inherited part of it, that whole demise, and looking at the fencing and stuff, that again was because of American encroachment. Because remember the Treaty of 1846, Cowlitz Farm was being taken left and right, and they were trying to establish their, the Hudson's Bay claim. They soon moved, like my great-great-grandfather, moved him and many of the Kanakas to the Nisqually Farm because of the encroachment. So their observation that it looked terrible was because there was only 2 people there to take care of that whole 3,000 acres.
Yeah, by about 1850 with the gold rush, all of the employees of Cowlitz Farm left and went to California. And that's kind of what ended the farm's operation about 1850. And they could no longer meet the Russian contract, and so they couldn't do anything with that anymore. And George Roberts was then left at the farm. He had taken a little leave, settled in Napavine, farmed his own property, and then the company put him back at the Cowlitz Farm to hold on to it until they could settle the Boundary Commission in 1869. So it was a long time that he himself held the farm, and his windows were shot, his crops and barns were burnt. There was a murder that took place on the site. That's a convoluted story that I don't actually understand all the way yet. And so there was a lot of, as a laborer from Fort Nisqually, we would call them squatters. But it was Americans. And they understood that Nisqually was going to be Hudson's Bay. The Cowlitz was a little bit more difficult just because it was more of a settled area. It was further south. It was in between those 2 areas. You mentioned something else that I was going to talk about, but I don't remember what it is now.
It's about crop rotation or the workers, who the workers were.
Oh, I remember what it is now. In 1847, in November of 1847, we have the Whitman Mission Massacre at Welaitepeu, where a measles outbreak in the Cayuse tribe resulted in the death of Narcissa and Dr. Whitman, thank you, and the arrest and retention of I don't know how many settlers that were at Welaitepeu at the time. When the news hit Cowlitz Farm, it's kind of a really scary entry because the author says that there's a massacre at Walla Walla, that's Peter Skeen Ogden is on his way, and they don't quite know what's going on. And so to have news travel that quickly, I think maybe this was in December when they got the news, so only a few months later. Or actually might have been a couple of weeks. So news was able to travel very fast in the area, but the measles didn't just stop with the Cayuse and Welaitepeu. In fact, in, I believe, 1847, again, at the Cowlitz Farm, over 75% of the tribe was killed in a disease outbreak at the Cowlitz Farm. And that kind of tipped the balance for the end of the farm. With over 75% of the population gone to help with the maintenance, George Roberts himself, his wife, and his 2 young daughters died in that epidemic, and so that's why he was actually stationed at the farm again. And the graves are still in the valley, and you can go. I don't know if you can actually see where they are. I think it's on tribal property now, but that's and in a lot of his memoirs he writes that he had such a close tie with the farm that there was no other option but him to stay on and fight against all the troubles that he had there just because of his close connection with the site. And so that kind of started the end of things, and then you have the gold rush and all your people go away. That's kind of, pardon?
All the remaining people.
All the remaining people, yes. And that kind of started putting the nails into the coffin of the farm itself. But interestingly, it actually played two important roles in the establishment of our own Washington Territory, because in 1853, the first territorial convention was hosted on the farm. And we know about the 54 convention at Monticello, but the 53 convention only kind of started the 54 convention, where they petitioned Congress to create a Washington Territory. And Monticello was the site of the two granaries that our grain was shipped to. So, and even George Roberts was present at that, the Boundary Commission, or not the Boundary Commission, but that the Territorial Convention, and also Dr. Tolmie and other Hudson Bay officials who were high officials going down there petitioning Congress for this, even though it wasn't going to apply to them at all. And so, interesting. Today, I-5 follows a lot of that corridor area. Yes?
Why didn't the farm benefit from people coming down the Oregon Trail that didn't go to California?
Why didn't it benefit? Because
Hundreds of thousands of people still came down the Oregon Trail.
it was Hudson Bay Company owned. And when those first Americans started to arrive, McLaughlin was asked by the Hudson Bay Company to not trade with them. And McLaughlin said, I don't think so. I see business opportunity here. And he was right. The Hudson Bay Company made a lot of money off the Americans, but it spelled their downfall. Because the Willamette Valley fills up, then it backflows up into here, and you have those settlers settling in and around the area. And when you don't really have a population left to defend your 4,000-acre claim, then you have people squatting out, and you have a lot of that stuff happening. And there was still a lot of British animosity in the American ideal. And this was a people that they had beaten in 2 wars. This was a people that they were going to beat in a third if they had to. Thankfully, it was only political, that the war that took place between Hudson's Bay Company and them. And they were also upset because we had the best land. And so that's why that interaction between the two, and why I believe that the farm was kind of left off the history books for a while, was because a lot of that animosity down there towards the mixed race peoples there, towards the British, a lot of that, when you have Americans telling the story, they're not going to tell the Hudson Bay story, and we can now because we have access to those documents, and that's how the farm really hasn't been covered in a lot of scholarship really that well, just because Hudson Bay documents haven't been always available. Yes, sir?
Currently, how many acres is the farm?
The farm no longer exists. The valley itself is thousands and thousands of acres. I'm not quite sure. When the surveying expedition came through, Jesse Applegate was the surveyor in charge. He was to survey what was Cowlitz Farm in 1846. Now, in 1846, the Cowlitz Farm was about 4,000 acres. But he only surveyed 400 to 500 acres of George Roberts' claim that he was farming at that time, and not the extent of the farm, which in the 1846 Oregon Treaty said that the company would be paid for their rights and improvements in the year 1846. And it's hard to keep buildings up for 30 years, especially when they're wood and built on top of the ground, because it rains, it rots, they fall to pieces. And so the farm in 46 and the farm in 69 or 65, when the surveyors came through, was 2 very different things. And in cross-examination, the attorney for the Hudson's Bay Company is like, what about this building, and what about this building, and what about this acreage, and what about this? And Applegate's like, I just did what I was told to do, and this is what we saw, and this is what we were told, and all this stuff. So the survey that we have from the farm is not an accurate survey that we should have had for the Boundary Commission. Yes?
Which Applegate was it?
I believe it was Jesse Applegate. He and there was 3 people that were part of that surveying commission by the United States government to go and survey Fort Vancouver, the Cowlitz Farm, and Fort Nisqually. Yeah.
So the current location of Cowlitz Farm, would that be, where would it be in relationship to the I-5 Cowlitz River crossing?
It would be just east. So if you take the Toledo exit and you keep going on, I think that's Old Highway 99 there, on Spencer Road, right at the Mission, you'll turn right onto Spencer Road. The Mission's right there. Everything east of the Mission, and the Mission was 640, a section of land that was given to them by the French-Canadian settlers. Everything along Spencer Road and east of that, for I don't know how far, would be the land, would be the property of the farm.
How close to Toledo?
It's about 3 miles northeast of Toledo. Toledo is a bit south of where Cowlitz Landing would have been, or Plamondon's Landing, as it was called. Plamondon's Mill was a little bit south of Cowlitz Landing, and then the landing was such it was a nice watered or carved out area because the river made that turn down, and then you would beach the bateau right onto the water or right onto the beach, and then offload it and do that. And that's what the Cowlitz tribe was doing with their canoes right there at the village. Yeah.
If anybody's interested, I live at Cowlitz Village, which is the St. Mary's Mission.
Okay.
The tribe is in negotiations to acquire part of that. But even so, the church does leave the cemetery open for visitation, and so do we. So it's really nice. If you just drive into Toledo, there is a landmark there with the Cowlitz Landing, and then you can come up and look at the mission and the cemetery. It's quite interesting.
And it is just absolutely beautiful, beautiful place too. If you get it on a clear day, I drove through January last year, and I had both mountains in view, and I could tell just how gorgeous this site would have been, and just such a picturesque landscape. Yeah.
Do people know the precise location of Cowlitz Landing? Because I remember reading that historians weren't really, maybe this is 20 years ago or something, weren't really sure exactly where it was.
The river's changed a lot within the last 160 or so years. So no. And then the area has flooded, and that's what happened to Cowlitz Landing, was it flooded away. We're not quite sure. That's still out there. I don't know if archaeology has been done as of late. Probably not, about the area. But the Cowlitz Landing was a very large settlement in the 1850s. Based off newspaper accounts in the area, there was a ton of advertisements for businesses that were down there. That was the stopping off point. If you wanted to come into the area, if you were a settler, the Cowlitz Road was very muddy. The military cut it in the 1850s. It was just a mud pit. And you would get in your bateau at Monticello, because they still used bateaus even after the company was gone. And you would come up, and I hope I'm not going over time yet. I don't think I am, but we're kind of in questions right now, which is great. And it would get up. There was a couple spots. There was a really shady hotel along the river, which I've read multiple accounts about. And a lot of the settlers said you weren't supposed to eat any of the food that they served. But that's where you would stay the night. It was somewhere close to Cathlapoodle, and then that was night 1, and then night 2 you'd be at Cowlitz Landing. And then from there, the company would have gotten horses from the Cowlitz tribe and then rode over to the Deschutes. But from there, they would have gotten into a wagon or a coach. At that time, there was a stagecoach at the time.
You could put it back on the other map. I think I could add some information. Right, go to the next one. That's the close-up.
Oh, well, there's a distinction.
Yeah, right there. Point to where the farm is. Okay, and then the next stream over is Camas Creek, and then the next one to the left, that is Ottawa Creek, and that would be where the first stop was. You go past Camas Creek, and then right where the river dips down to the south, no farther to the west, right in there, somewhere in there, was supposed to be Cowlitz Landing, but there are reports that it washed away, eroded away, and so all the evidence went downstream. And that dotted line that you see ascending north is probably the old trail that was turned into the military road. However, the people on the farm had other routes that they traveled north, and there was a whole network of trails that went north between the Cowlitz River and Puget Center.
And just right down here is a little sign that says, this is the end of the Cowlitz Trail. And because they would get into a canoe, they would somehow get around Tumwater Falls, and then out into Puget Sound, and from there, you can go anywhere you want via boat. And that was how most of the travel took place that time.
You mentioned salt being so important. Where do you know where they got their salt?
That's an excellent question. Salt was sourced locally. There was a salt marsh at the Nisqually Flats where Fort Nisqually sourced a lot of their salt. And then somewhere, I'm sure along the Columbia Corridor, somewhere, McLaughlin was gathering salt. Just because of if you want to preserve food, you have to salt it at the time. That's just, it was probably sea salt, a salt marsh, somewhere where you could get salt. It's not going to be exactly our table salt, but it'll serve the purpose of salting food and preserving it so they can ship it. Most of the meat, we didn't talk a lot about curing meat because that's was taken care of at Fort Nisqually, but a lot of that was being salted and then sent up to Russian Alaska. You don't want to ship cows alive. They don't like it. Yes.
Question about the crop rotation. You had on that map 2 different crops. Did they just alternate 2 crops, or is there a series? There's a series.
McLaughlin had about a 10 different type crop field rotation. We can go back to that. There's at the Cowlitz, they were doing wheat, peas, turnips, clover, coalseed, and then they would let fields lie fallow, and then they would graze it off too, and then they'd have Timothy. Timothy, they would actually plant Timothy after the field had gone through like a good 7 years run, and then they're going to plant Timothy and then set that on there for like 3 years. Use that as their hay source for their sheep and cattle that they had, and then plow that in, and then reset everything.
If that was where Roberts was, the Herons actually ended up there as well. So it's kind of fascinating. And that, if it is true that where the airport is, where that was, it makes sense because supposedly that's where the Cowlitz were incarcerated during the war, was at the Roberts, the few Hudson Bay buildings that still remain.
And that's what I heard too. The kind of the airport area is where the site itself would have been. It was up on a bluff, and I don't know how much the topography has changed, but you can see it in this map here. There is a line right here which shows the line to the hill, and they said it was actually a pretty steep bluff, and then the land down below would have been watered. And in this main photo, which Ware did, probably from the front porch of the house, you can see that they're way up high and that the fence kind of runs down the hill. And then you can see some of the barns and things and different outbuildings. And then in the foreground, this painting actually was never finished. He depicts, I don't know if it's himself or others, trading with Cowlitz tribal people sitting in the foreground here. It's hard to see in this image, but they're right about there, and a couple people there. I really like this painting. I am waiting on 2 others from the Hudson Bay Company archives that were done in 1860, which I discovered this past week.
Can you stay around a little while?
I absolutely can stay and take questions afterwards.